My name is Emily Carter. I'm 34 years old. And 2 years after my family stopped speaking to me, my older brother called and asked me to attend an awards banquet in his honor. 3 hours later, I found out he'd already promised the audience something that belonged to me. The worst part, he never asked. He assumed I'd do what I'd always done: show up, smile, and make his life easier. What he didn't know was that I'd spent the last 2 years learning how to say no. And before I tell you what happened next, make sure to subscribe to Sad Drama Stories and leave a comment telling me what you would have done in my position, because looking back now, the warning signs were obvious. I just wanted to believe my family had finally changed. 2 years earlier, I walked away from Carter Creative Solutions. Most people in our city thought my brother Daniel built that company himself. His face was on the website. His name was on the building. His interviews appeared in local business magazines. Every success story started with Daniel Carter, but the truth was a little more complicated. For 6 years, I had been the person behind almost every major system that kept the company running. I managed projects, built client workflows, solved operational disasters, trained staff, handled contracts. When clients had problems at midnight, they called me, not Daniel, me. I never cared about being famous. I never wanted my picture in magazines. I just wanted to do good work. That arrangement worked perfectly until Daniel landed the biggest contract in company history. The celebration dinner happened at a downtown hotel. Nearly 100 people attended: clients, partners, investors, employees. I remember standing beside Daniel while he accepted congratulations for months of work I had largely completed myself. Then one investor turned toward me and asked how long I'd been working as Daniel's assistant. I thought the man was joking. He wasn't. Daniel smiled and said, "Emily keeps everything organized." The room laughed. I laughed too, because sometimes humiliation arrives so unexpectedly that your brain mistakes it for a joke. The next morning, I handed in my resignation. My parents called within an hour, not to ask what happened, not to hear my side, not to understand why I was leaving. They called to tell me I was being selfish. Dad said family should support family. Mom said I was jealous of my brother's success. Daniel didn't call at all. 3 weeks later, I was removed from the family group chat. A month later, I stopped receiving invitations. Then birthdays passed, holidays passed, an entire year passed, then another. Silence became normal, which is why seeing Daniel's name appear on my phone that Thursday afternoon felt so strange. I almost ignored it. Almost. Instead, I answered. His voice sounded warm, friendly, like no time had passed at all. "Emily," he said, "I miss my sister." It was exactly what I wanted to hear, and exactly what I should have questioned. By the end of the conversation, he'd convinced me to attend an awards banquet the following Saturday. He said he wanted us to reconnect. He said he wanted the family together again. He said life was too short for old grudges. I agreed. What I didn't know was that 3 days before making that call, Daniel had already stood in front of the event organizers and publicly announced that I would be helping him with something very important. Something worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, something only I could provide, and he never bothered asking if I was willing. I spent the next week convincing myself I wasn't making a mistake. That should have told me everything. When a decision is right, you don't usually have to rehearse it in the shower, argue it in your car, and explain it to 3 different friends before it happens. But that's exactly what I did. My best friend Lauren told me not to go. She'd listened to 2 years of silence, birthdays ignored, holidays spent pretending I wasn't checking my phone. "Emily, people don't disappear for 2 years and suddenly become healthy," she said. I laughed, not because she was wrong, because I knew she was right. Still, I went. Part of me wanted answers, part of me wanted closure, and a very small, embarrassing part of me still wanted my family back. Not Daniel, not the version of my parents who chose sides. The family I remembered before everything became a competition, before every accomplishment became Daniel's accomplishment, before I learned that loyalty and obedience weren't the same thing. The banquet was scheduled for Saturday evening at the Grand Meridian Hotel downtown, one of the nicest venues in the city, the kind of place with marble floors and chandeliers that cost more than my car. I arrived 20 minutes early. Old habit, operations people are always early. As I crossed the lobby, I noticed banners displaying Daniel's face. Entrepreneur of the Year. His smile stretched across 6-foot displays positioned throughout the ballroom entrance. I stopped in front of one, not because I was impressed, because I recognized the project pictured behind him. A logistics platform we'd built 4 years earlier, a system I personally designed. The caption underneath credited Daniel alone. Something tightened in my chest. I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't there for credit, I was there for closure. Unfortunately, reality had other plans. Inside the ballroom, nearly 300 people filled round tables covered in white linen. Business owners, local officials, investors, reporters, the kind of crowd that enjoys applauding success. Daniel spotted me almost immediately. His face lit up, a little too brightly. He crossed the room and wrapped me in a hug before I could react. "She's here," he announced, not to me, to everyone around him, like I was an important guest he'd been worried might cancel. Several people turned, several smiled, and more than one person looked relieved. At the time, I didn't understand why. I would soon. Mom and Dad arrived a few minutes later. The reunion was strangely smooth. Too smooth, no apology. No explanation, no discussion about the last 2 years, just smiles, hugs, and repeated comments about how wonderful it was that everyone was together again. Nobody mentioned the silence. Nobody mentioned my resignation. Nobody mentioned the fact that I had essentially stopped existing to them. It was as if the last 2 years had been erased. Then dinner started, awards were handed out, speeches were delivered, the evening rolled forward without incident for a while. Then the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and announced Daniel's category. The room erupted in applause. Daniel stood, straightened his jacket, and headed toward the podium. I smiled politely, exactly as expected. Then he reached the microphone and everything changed. "I wouldn't be standing here tonight," he said, "without my sister Emily." The room applauded. My stomach dropped because this wasn't gratitude. This wasn't reconciliation. This was the beginning of something. I could hear it in his voice. Daniel continued smiling, continued speaking, and then he said the sentence that made my blood run cold. "In fact, Emily has generously agreed to help us launch our new expansion project next month." The applause grew louder. People turned toward me, investors, reporters, business owners, all smiling, all clapping, all believing something I had never agreed to. And as I sat frozen in my chair, Daniel looked directly at me from the stage. Then he smiled. The exact smile he used whenever he thought he had already won. The applause felt endless. 300 people smiling. 300 people celebrating an agreement that existed only inside my brother's imagination. I sat perfectly still, not because I was shocked, because I was calculating. I've spent most of my adult life solving problems under pressure. Restaurant managers do it during dinner rushes. Operations directors do it during system failures. You learn very quickly that panic never improves the situation. Information does, so I listened. Daniel continued speaking. "Family is everything," he told the audience. The crowd loved that. Of course they did. People always love family stories when they're not trapped inside them. He talked about loyalty, support, trust. Then he began describing the expansion project, a major regional growth plan, 3 new offices, a software platform, a logistics network connecting every location. Every sentence made one thing painfully clear. He wasn't asking for my help. He'd already promised it, publicly, to investors, to partners, to everyone in that room. He had spent 2 years not speaking to me, then invited me to an awards banquet so he could use 300 witnesses as leverage. The realization settled over me with surprising calm. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was disappointed. Again, when the speech ended, the audience stood for a standing ovation. Daniel accepted his award, shook hands, posed for photographs, and finally returned to our table. Mom immediately squeezed my hand. "Wasn't that wonderful?" "Wonderful." I looked at her, really looked at her. And for the first time all evening, I understood something. She knew, Dad knew, they all knew. This wasn't an impulsive comment. This was the plan. The entire reason I had been invited. "Emily," Dad said quietly, "we're proud of you." It was the first compliment he'd given me in years, and somehow it felt cheaper than an advertisement. Daniel sat down beside me, still smiling, still riding the energy of the room. "Pretty exciting, huh?" I took a sip of water. "When exactly was I planning to hear about this expansion project?" His smile flickered. only for a second, then it returned. I was getting to that. No, you weren't. The smile weakened. Around us, conversations resumed. People returned to their meals. Nobody noticed the shift at our table. Daniel lowered his voice. Emily, don't do this here. That sentence told me everything. Not I'm sorry, not I should have asked, not I made a mistake. Just don't do this here. Protect the performance, protect the image, protect Daniel, same as always. I haven't done anything, I said. Yet. Mom leaned closer. Sweetheart, everyone already knows. I looked at her. Knows what? That you're helping. There it was, the assumption, the entitlement, the certainty. Nobody was asking for permission because nobody believed they needed it. They still thought I was the same woman who would sacrifice her weekends, career, and peace of mind to keep everyone comfortable. The same woman who would say yes because saying no felt rude. Daniel relaxed slightly. Mistaking my calm for surrender, big mistake. He started explaining the project, projected revenue, investor commitments, construction timelines, staffing needs. The more he talked, the worse it became, because I understood every detail. And every detail revealed the same problem. The expansion wasn't finished. It wasn't funded. It wasn't operational. It wasn't even fully designed. The entire project depended on systems only I knew how to build. Daniel had promised investors something he couldn't deliver without me. And judging by the confidence in his voice, he genuinely believed public pressure would force me to cooperate. That might have worked 3 years ago. Maybe even 2, not anymore. Then something happened that Daniel never saw coming. One of the investors approached our table. A tall man in his 60s named Richard Hall. I recognized him immediately. One of the largest investors in the region, the kind of person whose signature changes lives. He smiled and extended his hand. Emily Carter, I shook it. It's nice to finally meet you. Finally meet me, Richard laughed. Daniel talks about you constantly. My brother's face froze just slightly. Richard continued. I'm looking forward to seeing what you build for the expansion. Then he said 6 words that changed the entire evening. I assume you've signed already? The table went silent. And for the first time all night, Daniel looked nervous. I assume you've signed already? For a moment, nobody spoke. Not me, not Daniel, not my parents. Richard Hall stood beside the table smiling pleasantly, completely unaware he'd just stepped on a landmine. I looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at me, and in that single second I saw something I hadn't seen all evening. Fear, small. Controlled, but real, because suddenly he wasn't speaking to family, he was speaking to investors, and investors asked questions. Signed what? I asked calmly. Richard's smile faded slightly. The partnership agreement, Daniel laughed. Too quickly, the kind of laugh people use when they're trying to outrun a problem. We're still finalizing paperwork. Richard nodded slowly, but his eyes stayed on me, not Daniel, me. That bothered my brother, I could see it. People had always paid more attention when I talked about operations than when Daniel talked about vision. Vision sounds exciting. Operations make things actually work. Richard pulled out a chair. Mind if I sit for a minute? Daniel absolutely minded. Unfortunately, nobody asked him. Richard sat. The conversation shifted. And within 5 minutes, I learned more about Daniel's expansion project than he'd ever intended me to know. The investors had already committed funding. The new offices had already been announced. The launch date had already been publicized. Several major clients had already signed preliminary agreements. Everything was moving forward, everything. Except one critical piece. The infrastructure, the systems, the operational framework, my designs, my expertise. The part Daniel had publicly promised without permission. The deeper Richard explained, the clearer the situation became. Daniel wasn't inviting me into a project. He'd built the entire project around me without telling me, without compensating me, without asking. And now he needed me to save it. Again, just like old times. The realization should have made me angry. Instead, it made me tired, because it was so familiar. Every major crisis in my family eventually arrived at the same destination. Emily will handle it. Emily will fix it. Emily will figure something out. The difference was that this time, nobody had bothered disguising it as love. Richard eventually stood. Well, I won't keep you. Then he smiled at me. I've heard impressive things about your work. Thank you. I look forward to seeing what you build. Then he walked away. The second he disappeared into the crowd, Daniel turned toward me. "What are you doing?" I blinked. "What am I doing? You embarrassed me." I actually laughed, not loudly, just enough. "Daniel, you announced a business agreement that doesn't exist." His jaw tightened. Mom immediately stepped in. "Sweetheart, let's not fight." Fight. Interesting word, because nobody called it a fight when they spent 2 years ignoring me. Nobody called it a fight when they lied to investors. Nobody called it a fight when they used a family reunion as a business strategy. Only my reaction seemed to qualify. Dad leaned forward. "Let's just discuss this privately." I looked around the ballroom. The award, the banners, the smiling investors, the reporters, the celebration. Then I looked back at my family. And suddenly something clicked into place. This wasn't a family reconciliation. It never had been. This was damage control. They hadn't invited me because they missed me. They invited me because they needed me. And now they were worried. Very worried, because for the first time in my life, they weren't entirely sure what I was going to do. The awards ceremony ended around 10 o'clock. People began leaving. Business cards changed hands. Photographers packed equipment. The ballroom slowly emptied. I grabbed my purse. Mom immediately stood. "Emily, wait." Daniel stood too. Dad followed. The three of them moving together felt strangely familiar, like a team heading into a meeting. "We need to talk," Daniel said. His voice had changed. The confidence was gone. The performance was over. Now he sounded like a man with a problem. I looked toward the hotel entrance, then back at my family. And for the first time all evening, I smiled. Not because I was happy, because I finally understood why they had called after 2 years, and I realized something even more important. Daniel wasn't afraid I would say no. He was afraid I'd tell the investors exactly why. Daniel wasn't afraid I would say no. He was afraid I'd tell the investors exactly why. That realization followed me into a private conference room 15 minutes later. The ballroom had mostly emptied. The celebration was over. Now it was just the four of us, me, Daniel, Mom, Dad, no audience, no applause, no performance. And somehow the room felt more honest than the entire evening had. Dad closed the door. Mom sat down immediately. Daniel stayed standing, pacing. That alone told me how nervous he was. My brother only paced when things were going badly. "Emily," Mom began, "we can work this out." Interesting. Not "we can rebuild our relationship." Not "we can heal." Not even "we can talk." "We can work this out," like a business problem, like a contract dispute, like a negotiation. I leaned back in my chair. "What exactly are we working out?" Nobody answered immediately. Daniel finally stopped pacing. "The investors are expecting you." There it was, not a family concern, a business concern. I almost thanked him for the honesty. "Why?" His jaw tightened. "You know why." "No, Daniel, explain it." Mom sighed dramatically, the way she used to when I asked uncomfortable questions as a teenager. "Sweetheart, don't make this harder than it needs to be." I looked at her. "Harder for who?" Silence. The answer was obvious, harder for them, not me. Dad cleared his throat. "The expansion needs experienced leadership." I nodded. "It does. And you have that experience." "I do." Daniel folded his arms. "You know you can do this?" I almost laughed. Notice what nobody had said, not once. Nobody had asked if I wanted to. Nobody had asked what I needed. Nobody had discussed compensation, ownership, partnership, authority, nothing. Only what Daniel needed. Same story, different year. Finally, I asked the question that should have been asked months ago. "What exactly are you offering?" The room froze. Mom blinked. Dad looked confused. Daniel looked annoyed. As though the question itself was inappropriate. That told me everything. They hadn't prepared an offer because they never expected a negotiation. They expected compliance. I continued calmly. "What percentage ownership?" Daniel stared. "What, for the expansion?" His expression went completely blank. I continued. "What percentage of the company?" Mom interrupted immediately. "Emily, this isn't about money." I turned toward her. "Then why am I here?" Nobody answered. Again, because we all knew the answer. The expansion represented millions of dollars. Investors weren't writing checks because Daniel was charming. They were writing checks because they believed operational systems existed. Systems I had built, systems Daniel could not replicate. Without me, the project became significantly riskier, maybe impossible. Daniel finally sat down. For the first time all evening, he looked tired. Really tired, not angry, not defensive, just exhausted. The company is struggling. The words surprised me. Mom looked down, Dad stared at the table. And suddenly pieces started falling into place. The urgency, the sudden reconciliation, the public announcement, the investors, the pressure. The performance, it wasn't confidence, it was desperation. Daniel rubbed his face. We've lost 3 major clients this year. Nobody spoke. The operational team quit 6 months ago. Another silence. The expansion announcement was supposed to stabilize things. I sat very still, listening, calculating, the picture becoming clearer with every sentence. Then Daniel said something that changed everything. Something he probably didn't intend to reveal. We've already spent most of the investment money. The room went completely silent. Even Mom looked shocked. Dad closed his eyes. And for the first time all evening, I realized this situation was much worse than anyone had admitted. Much worse, because now I understood why they had called me. This wasn't about helping Daniel succeed. This was about preventing him from collapsing, and judging by the look on my father's face, the collapse might have already started. We've already spent most of the investment money. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The words just sat there in the middle of the conference room like a crack spreading across glass. I looked at Daniel, then at Dad, then at Mom. And for the first time that evening, I wasn't angry. I was alarmed, because there are mistakes. And then there are mistakes that destroy companies. I knew the difference. I'd spent half my career cleaning up after both. How much? I asked. Daniel looked away. That answer alone told me it was bad. Daniel, his shoulders tightened. About 70%. I actually thought I'd misheard him. 70%? Nobody corrected me. Nobody said I was wrong. Dad stared at the table. Mom looked close to tears. 70%, the expansion hadn't launched. The systems weren't built, the infrastructure didn't exist, and most of the money was already gone. Every alarm bell in my professional brain started ringing at once. What did you spend it on? Daniel immediately became defensive. Business expenses? That's not an answer. It was necessary. Neither is that. His jaw clenched, the same way it always did when facts refused to cooperate with his story. Finally, Dad spoke. His voice sounded older than I remembered. A lot of it went toward existing obligations. I turned toward him. Existing obligations. Translation, debt. The room was suddenly making much more sense. The expansion wasn't a growth strategy. It was a rescue strategy. Daniel hadn't announced it because the company was thriving. He announced it because he was running out of options. Investors brought cash. Cash bought time. Time delayed consequences, but only if the project succeeded. And apparently the project depended on me. Daniel leaned forward. Emily, listen. I hated that phrase. People only say listen when they haven't been listening themselves. You know this business? He pointed toward the ballroom. Those investors trust you, not me personally, my work, my reputation, the credibility I'd spent years building, the credibility he was trying to borrow. Again. We can still fix this? We, interesting choice of word, because when things were going well, it had always been his company. Now that things were falling apart, suddenly it was we. Mom reached for my hand. I didn't pull away. But I didn't squeeze back either. Sweetheart, families help each other. There it was, the same argument, just wearing different clothes, not an apology, not accountability, an obligation, a debt they believed I owed. I looked at my mother carefully, then at my father, then at Daniel. 3 people who hadn't spoken to me in 2 years, 3 people who now needed something, and not one of them had said the simplest sentence in the English language. We were wrong, not one. I stood up. The movement startled them. Daniel immediately rose too. Where are you going? Home. The answer came into my head instantly. Home, to my apartment, to my peace. To a life that somehow functioned perfectly well before this phone call happened. But I wasn't ready to leave yet. Not quite. Because there was one question still bothering me, one question I couldn't stop thinking about. I looked directly at my brother. When exactly were you planning to tell the investors the truth? The room froze. Daniel's face changed just for a second, but it changed. And that second was enough, because suddenly I knew there was no plan. No disclosure, no correction, no transparency. He had intended to keep going, to keep promising, keep performing, keep borrowing credibility, and hope nobody noticed until it was too late. The realization settled over me slowly. Professionally, it terrified me. Personally, it broke my heart. Because the brother sitting across from me wasn't the brother I remembered, and the decision I was about to make would affect far more than one company. It would decide whether hundreds of employees still had jobs 6 months from now. And as I looked at Daniel's face, I realized something that made my stomach drop. I already knew what the right decision was. The problem was that nobody in that room was going to like it. I already knew what the right decision was. The problem was that nobody in that room was going to like it. Especially Daniel, especially my parents, because the truth was simple. The company didn't need a miracle, it needed honesty. And honesty was the one thing nobody in my family seemed willing to offer. I looked at Daniel, then at the conference room window overlooking the empty ballroom. Employees would show up Monday morning expecting paychecks. Vendors would expect payments. Clients would expect results. Investors would expect progress reports. Real people, real consequences. This wasn't just a family argument anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. "Emily," Daniel said carefully, "just tell me what you need." I almost laughed. Because after 6 years of taking my work for granted, after 2 years of silence, after using my name in front of 300 people without permission, he finally wanted to negotiate. The timing was incredible. "What I need," I said quietly, "isn't the problem." Daniel frowned. "Then what is?" "The truth." Nobody spoke. I continued. "The investors deserve the truth." Dad immediately sat forward. "Emily, no." For the first time all evening, I interrupted him. "The employees deserve the truth." Mom looked frightened now, not angry, frightened. "The clients deserve the truth." Daniel stood up. "You're going to destroy everything?" I looked at him. "No," I shook my head. "You already did that." The silence that followed felt enormous, because deep down everyone in that room knew it was true. The expansion hadn't failed because I left. It failed because Daniel built promises faster than he built reality. And eventually reality always collects its debt. I picked up my purse. Daniel's voice cracked. "What happens now?" For the first time all evening, I answered honestly. "Tomorrow morning I'll meet with Richard Hall." His face went pale. Mom stood up. "You can't." "Watch me." Dad closed his eyes. Like a man finally seeing the end of a road he'd spent years pretending wasn't there. The next morning I met Richard, and I told him everything. Not emotionally, not dramatically, professionally. The missing infrastructure, the unfinished systems, the operational risks, the financial concerns, everything. Richard listened for nearly 2 hours. When I finished, he thanked me. "That was all, just thank you." 3 weeks later, the expansion project was suspended. An independent audit was ordered. Several investors withdrew. Daniel resigned as CEO 2 months afterward. The company survived, barely. A new leadership team was brought in. The employees kept their jobs, which mattered more than anything else. As for my family, Mom called 6 months later, not asking for money, not asking for favors, just calling. For the first time in years, we had a real conversation. Short, awkward, honest. Dad eventually apologized too, not perfectly, not dramatically, but sincerely. Daniel took longer, almost a year. His apology arrived in a handwritten letter. No excuses, no blame, just accountability. I still have it. The strange thing is that people assume this story ends with revenge. It doesn't. The company survived, the employees survived, my family changed. Slowly, painfully, but they changed, and so did I. Because the biggest lesson wasn't learning how to say no. It was learning that love and obligation are not the same thing. The people who truly care about you don't only call when they need something. And your value is not measured by what you're willing to sacrifice to keep everyone else comfortable. That's my story. One awards banquet, one public lie, and one decision that finally forced everyone to face the truth. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe to Sad Drama Stories, and leave a comment sharing what you would have done in my place. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next story.